In early 2001, 32-year-old Alex Algieri stood behind the front desk at the Dolphin Fitness Club in Amityville, New York. Alex loved the sounds of a crowded gym, the music pumping through the speakers, weights sliding onto bars, and people cheering each other on as they hit their fitness goals. And a crowded gym also meant that Alex was making money. He and his best friend, Paul Riedel, had opened up Dolphin Fitness 2 years earlier, and they had turned it into a favorite spot for serious weightlifters and amateur weightlifters alike. There was no question Alex was happy about all the money he was bringing in. He'd always dreamed of being a very successful entrepreneur, but the gym was a lot more to him than just a business. Amityville was a small town on Long Island with a strong sense of community, and Alex wanted his and Paul's gym to reflect that. So from the day they had opened Dolphin Fitness, Alex said he wanted everybody who stepped through the doors to feel like they were part of a family. It didn't matter if people were old or young or what kind of shape they were in. Alex went out of his way to help his customers feel good about themselves and to feel like they belonged, and his customers loved him for it. Alex stepped out from behind the front desk and began making his rounds on the gym floor. Alex was a really strong guy. He was just about 6 feet, maybe a little bit under, but he looked like a very serious bodybuilder, super jacked. So most people at the gym called him Big Al. Alex had dark hair and a dark goatee, and on this day he was wearing a long-sleeved black shirt and tight jeans, his standard outfit at work. Alex said hello to just about everybody on the gym floor. He knew pretty much everybody by name. And he was excited to see some new members starting off the new year by coming to his gym. Just then, a young man waved at Alex and asked if he wouldn't mind coming over and spotting him on the bench. And Alex said that was fine, and he walked over to the bench press, and Alex told the young man he'd be ready to grab the bar if the young man struggled to lift it. So the young man took a deep breath, he grabbed the bar, brought it down to his chest, and then in one slow but steady movement, he pressed the bar all the way up, and Alex spotted him the whole time shouting words of encouragement, and then finally when the young man had fully extended his arms and fully did a rep, he racked the bar, and he and Alex exchanged high fives and cheered like he just won the Super Bowl or something. Just then, Alex turned and saw a couple of people standing by the front desk. He figured they were potential new members. So Alex scanned the gym and then just shook his head. His partner Paul was supposed to be here right now working too, and really it would have been his job to talk to these 2 new potential members, but Alex hadn't seen Paul on the gym floor in hours. So Alex walked away from the young man he had just spotted and headed over to the front desk and smiled wide and greeted the couple. The rest of that night pretty much went the same way. Alex did everything and ran the gym, and Paul didn't show his face again. And by the end of the night, after Alex had said goodbye to the last customers and locked up, he was feeling frustrated. Why should he do all the work, but still give Paul half the profits? Alex angrily marched his way towards the back of the gym, past some aerobics rooms to a small office. Alex knew this is where he would find Paul. Alex opened the door, and there was Paul hunched over in a chair and tapping his fingers on a table. Paul didn't look up when Alex walked in. It was like he was off in his own world. Alex figured Paul must be high on cocaine or some other drug. It was a sight that Alex saw way too often. It made him mad because Paul was his business partner and he wasn't doing his job. But it also broke Alex's heart because Paul really was his best friend, and to see him struggle like this was hard. The 2 men had known each other for years, and they'd gotten along from the first time they'd met. They'd both grown up as working-class kids who dreamed of having their own business someday, and they both loved lifting weights and bodybuilding. So after becoming fast friends, they began to come up with a plan to open their own gym. For years, Alex and Paul had worked different jobs to save up money, and they had also found some outside investors who believed in them. And so eventually, when they had scraped all the cash together, they opened up Dolphin Fitness together. Now, most people who knew them said these 2 were closer than brothers. Alex had been Paul's best man at his wedding, and he was the godfather to Paul and his wife Leanne's baby boy. Back in the office, Alex shouted Paul's name, and Paul finally realized Alex was in the room with him. When Paul turned around and looked up, Alex could see his eyes were totally bloodshot. Alex really laid into Paul for not helping him run the gym that night, and he said he didn't understand what Paul was even doing with his life. They had achieved their dream of starting their own business. And on top of that, Paul had a beautiful wife and child, so why was he throwing everything away on drugs and partying like he was still a crazy bachelor in his early 20s? Paul was very defensive and shouted a few obscenities at Alex, and then basically just told Alex to leave him alone. But Alex said he'd had enough. He told Paul that he was ready to dissolve their business partnership and go start his own gym if he had to. That got Paul's attention. He stood up and walked right towards Alex. And Alex was a big guy, but Paul was like a giant. Paul was 6 foot 7 inches tall with a massive chest and huge arms. And Paul just started screaming, and Alex screamed right back. But Alex knew Paul was not someone to mess with when he was high and also angry. So pretty quickly, Alex just said he was done talking for the night, and he walked out of the office. From the hallway, Alex heard Paul scream at the top of his lungs, and then he heard the sound of an office chair go flying into the wall. Alex angrily clenched his jaw, picked up his pace, and grabbed his coat from behind the front desk. Then he headed out the back door of the gym to the parking lot, he climbed into his black Yukon SUV, and took off. And as he drove, he figured Paul was still probably screaming and throwing more furniture. The following day at the gym, Paul apologized to Alex. Alex was used to this. His friend would do drugs, he would lash out, say stupid things, and then feel bad about it the next day and say he was sorry. Alex accepted Paul's apology like he always did, but he just felt tired from having to deal with the same thing over and over again. Alex was all about family, and he loved the people close to him almost unconditionally. But even he was reaching a breaking point with Paul, and he knew he was not the only one who felt this way. Paul's wife, Leanne, was also fed up with Paul's drug use and angry outbursts. In fact, she was so upset with her husband that she'd gone to stay with her mother in Florida until she could figure out if she even wanted to stay married. Alex knew that Leanne leaving had made it really hard on Paul, but he couldn't blame her. After all, the night before, Alex had threatened to leave Paul and go start his own gym. And Alex had meant what he said, but he knew scrapping the Dolphin Fitness Club and trying to start his own gym would not happen overnight. So Alex decided to look at all of his options and start putting together a new business plan. That way he would feel like he was working towards something. And in the meantime, he hoped and prayed that Paul would get his life together and go back to being the great business partner and best friend that he used to be. A couple of weeks later, on the night of January 17th, 2001, Alex was back behind the front desk at the gym. Paul had taken a couple of nights off, which left Alex to run the place on his own. But Alex was used to that, and he really hoped the time away from the gym would do Paul some good. Alex made his usual rounds on the gym floor, talking to customers and encouraging the weightlifters, and then at some point, he heard a woman who was over on the exercise machines shout "Big Al" over the music. Alex turned and smiled at the woman and began walking over to her. When he reached her, she was very sweaty and out of breath, and she told him right away how excited she was about all the results she was seeing from all her exercising, but she told Alex that she just could not get on board with the music that was playing, and could he please change it? Alex laughed and said of course he would change it, but she told him there was actually this one particular album that really motivated her to work even harder at the gym. And she said Alex had played it during a fitness class that she'd taken from him. And immediately, Alex knew exactly the song she was talking about. He said he had the CD in his car, and he'd just go grab it. Then he turned away from the woman and began walking towards the back door. The cold air hit Alex as soon as he walked out to the parking lot. It was around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, so just above freezing. Alex's coat was still hanging up inside the gym, but it wasn't worth going back for. He'd spent enough winters in Amityville to be used to this kind of cold. So Alex hustled across the parking lot to his black Yukon. When he got to it, he opened up the driver's side door, and the dome light came on. Alex leaned into the SUV and started digging through the CDs that he kept in a case in the passenger seat. Then Alex heard someone shouting behind him in the parking lot, so he pulled his head out of the SUV and he turned to see what was going on, and when he did, he saw someone running directly towards him in the darkness. Back inside the gym, the woman who had asked Alex to change the music, she wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked off towards the back exit. Alex had been gone way longer than she thought he would be, but she figured he must be just having a hard time finding the CD, or maybe he'd stopped in his office to make a phone call before coming back to the gym floor. But then, the woman saw something, and she screamed. Several people stopped their workouts and ran to her to see if she was okay, but she just pointed towards the back of the gym, and then more screams rang out above the music. Alex staggered onto the gym floor. Blood poured down his neck and soaked through his shirt. People ran up to him and he looked at them, and in a strangled voice he said, "I've been shot." Alex collapsed to the ground. A woman who was a nurse rushed to his side and checked his pulse and immediately began administering CPR. At the same time, a man ran to the front desk and grabbed the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, police and paramedics arrived at the gym. and right away Alex was put on a gurney and rushed outside to a waiting ambulance. Someone had turned off the music by this point, so everybody in the gym just stood there in stunned silence. Most of them were in shock, and they couldn't understand what had even just happened. Everybody loved Alex. Why would someone shoot him? The local police stayed to question everybody at the gym about what they had seen, but their main goal was simply just to get names and contact information for everybody who was there. They knew that a violent crime like this one, that had seemingly just occurred, would quickly be handed off to a larger police force, and so they just wanted to gather up some names to hand off. A couple of hours later, Detective Robert Anderson of the Suffolk County Police Department stepped out of his car in front of the hospital. Anderson looked and dressed more like a professor than a cop. And people who had worked with Anderson during his 34 years in law enforcement said he had a mind like a professor too. He was highly analytical and rarely satisfied with simple answers. Detective Anderson had gotten word that Alex Alguerri had been shot outside of the gym that he owned, and Alex had been declared dead soon after being rushed to the hospital. From the minute Anderson was told he would be leading a homicide investigation in Amityville, he knew there would be a ton of pressure on him to solve the case fast. Because Amityville was not your typical town. Amityville, for decades, had been associated with murder and dark forces. Almost 30 years earlier, in 1974, an Amityville man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. had killed his mother, father, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters in their home. The media attention from the mass murder was bad enough for the small, quiet town, but things had only gotten stranger for Amityville after that. The family that wound up moving into the DeFeo house where those murders happened claimed they were terrorized by a demon or some other supernatural entity in the house. This claim eventually drew the attention of very famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who came out and did their own investigation, and the story of this demon or entity in the home also was eventually turned into a book called The Amityville Horror. And that book has since been spun off into movies and TV shows. I mean, Amityville really became synonymous with evil. And so Detective Anderson knew that Amityville community leaders had worked really hard over the years to kind of correct their image. They didn't want to be known as this violent or cursed town. But this brutal shooting in a gym parking lot threatened to put Amityville right back in the national news for all the wrong reasons. Anderson walked into the hospital and found his way to the private room where Alex's father was waiting for him. Alex's father wiped tears from his face, cleared his throat, and introduced himself to Anderson. But before Alex's father could say much more than his name, he broke down in tears again. Even after 34 years as a cop and dealing with some of the most notorious murders on Long Island, nothing could really prepare Anderson for meeting a parent who had just lost their child. It was the worst kind of loss Anderson could imagine, and seeing Alex's father in so much pain really hit him hard. He told Alex's father how sorry he was for his loss. Then Anderson said he hated to put him on the spot at that moment, but he did need to know if there was anyone who might have wanted to hurt his son. Alex's father wiped away his tears and then told Anderson that Alex was the sweetest, kindest man you'd ever meet, and that everybody who knew him really loved him. But then he said there definitely was one person who could have done this to his son: Alex's best friend and business partner, Paul Riedel. It turned out Alex had told his father all about Paul's drug use and his partying, and he had also told him that he was thinking about scrapping the business with Paul and going out on his own. Anderson thanked Alex's father for his help and told him how sorry he was again. Then Anderson left the hospital and drove back to the station. He wanted to gather as much information as he could on Paul. It didn't take long for Detective Anderson to discover that Paul had had more than his fair share of run-ins with the law. He had served time in prison for drug charges and armed robbery, and he had previously been linked to an illegal sports gambling ring. But Anderson knew that did not mean the man had killed his best friend, so for the time, Anderson put Paul's police record to the side and dug more into his personal life and his relationship with Alex. The local Amityville police had passed along contact information for everybody they found at the gym when they had first arrived there. And when Anderson and his team reached out to those people, they all said pretty much the same thing. Alex was like family, and everybody loved him. But Paul, he was a mess, and he definitely was capable of shooting Alex. Some of Alex's family and closest friends were even more straightforward when they spoke to Anderson. They said they were sure Paul had to be the murderer. So Anderson knew he would just have to go talk to Paul, but he didn't want to drag Paul to the station and chuck him inside of an interrogation room just yet, because he feared as soon as he did that, all of Amityville would decide Paul really was guilty. And so that could potentially destroy an innocent man's life, and it could put even more pressure on police to arrest someone before they were actually ready. So Anderson actually came up with a fairly outside-the-box way to question Paul that was not super formal. Now, it was not going to be ideal by any means, but it was an opportunity Anderson didn't want to miss. His team would talk to Paul at Alex's funeral. Days after Alex's murder, a line of cars stretched out down the street in front of a local funeral home, and they wrapped around the corner. Hundreds of people had come to pay their last respects to Alex. Detective Anderson filed into the funeral home behind a group of mourners. It was common for investigators to attend funerals for homicide victims. It gave them a chance to watch how potential suspects acted. But Anderson was really just there to observe Paul and to see if he could get any information from Paul after the service was over. Anderson watched as Paul made his way to the front of the chapel inside of the funeral home. And it immediately became clear to Anderson that it didn't matter to other people that Paul had not been brought in for questioning yet. Clearly, they had already decided Paul was guilty. People literally shouted at Paul as he walked down the aisle towards his best friend's coffin. They told him to leave and said how dare he show his face here. Paul didn't engage with any of them. He just stared at the floor and clung to his wife Leanne as he walked. Detective Anderson couldn't get over how small this enormous guy seemed to look at this very moment. But Anderson didn't know if he should feel sorry for Paul or if he was just being too cautious and too analytical. Maybe everybody else was right. Maybe this case was clear-cut, and Paul really was the killer. Anderson watched as Alex's friends and family talked about how much Alex had meant to them and how proud they had been of him. Alex's father fought back tears and spoke about all the special times he'd shared with his son. Then he broke down and said Alex would never get to experience those kind of moments with a child of his own, because someone had taken that chance away from him. After the funeral was over, Anderson and some other members of his team separated from the throng of mourners and followed Paul and his wife Leanne outside. The investigators approached, and as they did, Paul suddenly stood up to his full height. Suddenly, the small, kind of sad-looking man Anderson had seen inside had disappeared. Paul now looked angry and huge. Clearly, he did not like the fact that police were bothering him at his best friend's funeral. Anderson assured Paul they were only trying to get some basic information. So Paul just said he loved Alex, he would never hurt him, and on the night of the murder, he said he was with friends in another town. For a minute, Anderson figured his big plan to try to question Paul at this funeral was going to turn into a total bust. But right as he was about to give up on this approach, something suddenly stood out to him. Paul's wife, Leanne, was standing next to her husband doing her part as a very supportive spouse. But Anderson had briefly spoken to Leanne in the days following the murder, so he knew that she and Paul had serious problems in their marriage and that she had even gone to Florida to get away from Paul. And so now Anderson wanted to know if she had had like a big change of heart about her husband, which is why she was now being so supportive, or if she was acting supportive out of fear. If Paul had really killed Alex and Leanne knew about it, was she just afraid she'd be next if she didn't support him? On January 23, 2001, so 6 days after the murder, Detective Anderson met with Leanne at her grandmother's house in a small town that was not too far from Amityville. Leanne was short and thin with long brown hair, and she sounded like a native New Yorker. She led Anderson into a warm, rustic-looking kitchen, and they sat down at the table. Anderson didn't want Leanne to feel like she was being interrogated, so when he spoke to her like they were just two friends catching up. Anderson asked Leanne about the funeral and how she felt when she was there, and very quickly she made it clear that she had not gone there out of fear or anything like that. She had been there because she loved her friend Alex, and she wanted to support her husband Paul. She said that despite their marital issues, they really had been working hard on their marriage. But Anderson wasn't convinced, and so he pressed Leanne a bit, and he asked what had happened that made her leave New York and go to Florida in the first place. Leanne said she'd left because Paul was partying and doing drugs, and she felt like that was a terrible environment for her kid. But Leanne was clear that she did not believe Paul would ever kill his friend Alex. Sure, the two men fought sometimes, but they were like brothers, and brothers fight. She knew Paul loved Alex. Anderson said he understood, and then he asked her if there was anything else she could think of that might help with the investigation. Leanne shifted in her chair and then looked around the room like she was trying to make sure nobody else was listening. Then she leaned closer to Anderson, and in a quiet voice, she told him there was something going on that he needed to know about. Paul had gotten into trouble with the mob, and he had actually received a rat card in the mail. Anderson hid his surprise pretty well, but this was news to him. He knew Paul had a police record and that he'd been linked to some low-level criminals who might have loose ties to the mob. But receiving a rat card meant that members of the mob believed Paul had sold them out to the police, an unforgivable offense in the world of organized crime. Then Leanne told Anderson that things had actually gotten even worse after that. At a big party a year earlier, Paul had gotten into this big public argument with a man who wound up being a captain in the Gambino organized crime family. At the time, the Gambinos were one of the most powerful mafia organizations in New York City. Leanne said Paul never told her what the argument was about, but she was pretty sure he owed a lot of money to some very powerful people. Detective Anderson listened quietly, and he still didn't show anything on his face, but he knew this case might have just taken a major turn. It was one thing for Paul to be connected to some small-time criminals in Amityville, New York, but it was a whole different thing for Paul to be in debt to high-ranking members of a New York City mafia family. Anderson talked to Leanne a little while longer and then thanked her for her time. He headed out to his car and drove back to Amityville. In the course of only a few hours, Anderson had been forced to take a completely different view on this case. He still considered Paul a suspect, but now Anderson had a totally new theory as to what could have happened. He thought maybe the mafia had put out a hit on Alex, so Paul's best friend, as a way to warn Paul, "Pay us the money you owe us, or you'll be next." In February of 2001, so about a month after Alex's murder, Detective Anderson got word that Paul and Leanne had reconciled and repaired their marriage. But there was more to the story than that. Paul had moved with Leanne and their kid down to Florida, and members of Alex's family and a lot of other people in Amityville were up in arms about it. Many people in the community had never stopped believing that Paul killed Alex, and now they thought Paul had left the state to run away from the crime he had committed. The pressure on Anderson to arrest Paul continued to grow, and some people questioned whether Anderson was even doing his job. But Anderson understood their frustration. He also wanted to bring Alex's killer to justice. But he wasn't just going to cave in and arrest Paul because he actually didn't have any concrete evidence against Paul. Anderson's team had confirmed Paul's alibi for the night of the murder, and they'd combed over the crime scene at the gym multiple times, and nothing they found directly linked Paul to Alex's murder. On top of that, Anderson was following up on leads that connected Paul to the mafia. He was supposedly in debt to dangerous men, he had had that public fight with a member of the Gambino family, and Alex's murder did seem to look like it could have been a mob-style hit. So Anderson remained focused and calm, and he kept pursuing all of the possible leads in the case. He also told his team not to be swayed by public opinion. Just because others had already made up their minds about what had happened did not mean they needed to do that too. But over the next month, Anderson hit one dead end after another. He couldn't discover any definitive links between Paul and the Gambino family or any other high-ranking members in the mafia. Then, in April, so 3 months after Alex's murder, Anderson found out that Leanne was pregnant. And this news sparked another round of anger from the Amityville community and threatened to make Anderson's job even harder than it already was. People were outraged that Paul was allowed to carry on with his life and watch his family grow after he had robbed his best friend Alex of a chance to start his own family. Anderson continued to sympathize with the people who were frustrated with him. He knew they just wanted answers. So Anderson kept working every angle of the case he could think of, but he felt like he was running out of time. He needed a break in the case to help appease his loudest critics and to at least give Alex's family some hope that justice would be served. On November 11th, 2001, so almost 10 months after Alex's murder, a detective from the New York City Police Department sat across a table from a guy in custody and listened to him rambling about how he could help the police. The NYPD detective almost found the whole thing kind of amusing. It was pretty common for people in custody to try to cut a deal by giving up information on crimes that were even worse than the ones they'd committed. A lot of times, though, the so-called leads these people provided went absolutely nowhere. But occasionally, some leads would pan out. So the detective sat there with a slight smile on his face and just listened. But then the guy in custody said something that really caught the detective's attention. And so his smile disappeared, and he leaned forward and told the guy to slow down and repeat what he just said. The guy nodded and leaned in closer, almost like he and the detective were on the same team. Then he repeated what he had just said. He said he knew who had killed that gym owner in Amityville, and he knew why they killed him. Now remember, Amityville is a small town about 2 hours away from Manhattan, and so criminals trying to cut a deal with the NYPD did not usually reference small town crimes like this one. So the detective sensed this could actually be legitimate. So he got all the details he could from this guy in custody about Alex Aguirre's murder. Then the detective walked out of the room, went to his desk, and made a phone call. A second later, an officer with the Suffolk County Police told Detective Anderson there was a call for him from an NYPD detective. The officer said that this detective was calling with information about the Alex Aguirre case, and it could potentially break the case wide open. Anderson walked to his desk, and as he did, he felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the first time in months that he actually might have a possible new lead. On the phone, the NYPD detective told Anderson about the conversation he'd just had with the guy in custody. Both detectives were well aware that desperate people under arrest were not usually the most reliable sources, because they basically will do anything to get out of custody, but the NYPD detective thought the information he'd gotten was actually worth passing on. Anderson listened to the detective and scribbled down the name of a man that he needed to track down. Anderson thanked the NYPD detective for his help, and then he quickly rounded up his team and told them they might finally have a major break in the Alex Aguirre case. The information Anderson got from the NYPD detective led him right to a man who was supposedly involved in Alex's murder. The man was clearly struggling with drug addiction. He seemed jittery and all over the place when he spoke, and he spun a wild story about how and why Alex had been murdered. At first, Anderson wasn't sure he could believe anything this man told him, but Anderson and his team dug deeper into the man's story, and several of the details checked out. And after that meeting, it would still take Detective Anderson several months to put everything together, but he finally had evidence connecting someone directly to Alex's murder. Based on interviews conducted throughout the investigation and evidence found at the scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night of January 17, 2001, when somebody murdered Alex outside of his gym. At about 7 p.m., a white minivan drove past the Dolphin Fitness Club. Inside the van were two people. There was the driver and also the killer. And the killer was scanning the area for the perfect spot to stake the place out. Both people inside the van wore zip-up hooded sweatshirts, and the killer rested a .38 caliber pistol on his knee. The killer pointed to an empty parking space on the street that had a clear view of the employee parking lot. So the driver drove around towards the back of the gym, pulled the van into that parking space, and then turned off the engine. Then the driver and the killer kept their eyes fixed on the employee parking lot and made small talk to pass the time. The killer figured it could be hours before they could make their move, but they were willing to wait as long as it took, because this area, this employee parking lot, offered the best place to shoot someone without being seen. The lot was dark, and only a few people ever parked there. The killer checked their gun to make sure it was loaded, then they, along with the driver, just kept on talking and watching the parking lot. But then, just 20 minutes later, the killer suddenly sat up in the passenger seat and leaned in closer to the window. The wait had not been long at all. Their target was already in the parking lot, walking towards his black Yukon SUV. The killer told the driver to start the van and to be ready to speed out of there. The killer clutched the pistol tight in one hand, then opened the door with the other, and walked into the parking lot. The killer saw Alex open up his car door and lean inside, and as he did, the dome light came on. Not wanting to be too close to the light, the killer shouted something at Alex just to get his attention and to kind of pull him away from his vehicle and the light. And it worked because Alex turned to see who was yelling at him, and he took a few steps away from his car towards the killer. And at that point, the killer just rushed out of the darkness and got within a couple of feet of Alex, who had no idea what was going on, and the killer raised his gun and fired before Alex could do anything. The first bullet hit Alex square in the chest. Then the killer squeezed off 3 more shots, one right after the other. Bullets struck Alex across his upper body, perforating his heart and both of his lungs. Then the killer fired off one more shot, which hit Alex in the neck. Alex fell to the ground, covered in blood. At this point, the killer turned and ran back to the white van. The killer never saw Alex pulling himself up and staggering back towards the gym. As soon as the killer was back inside the van, they slammed the door shut and yelled for the driver to go. So the driver whipped out of the parking space and sped down the street. A few minutes later, the driver heard ambulance and police sirens on the other side of the road, so they eased off the gas. They didn't want to draw attention to the van. When they were a few miles away from the gym, the killer spotted a creek just off the side of the road. So they rolled down their window and hurled the gun into the water. Then they told the driver to floor it, and the van sped down the road again. Not long after that, the driver pulled onto the highway, and the van headed south, far away from Amityville, New York. The following night, the killer and the driver sat in the killer's living room reading an online story about the murder. The shooting outside the gym had made the national news, but the killer and driver read the story more than once because they could not believe what they were seeing. Then the front door opened, and before the killer could even say anything, a woman barged in and shouted at him at the top of her lungs, "You stupid bastard, you killed the wrong guy!" It would turn out Leanne Riedel, Paul's wife, had set up the hit outside of the gym. But Alex was never the intended target. Leanne had wanted her husband, Paul, dead. And the killer, a man named Rocco Salerno, had been more than happy to oblige, because it turned out that Leanne and Rocco had been having an affair since Leanne had left New York and went to stay with her mother in Florida. Leanne and Rocco had fallen in love and wanted to start their lives together, but Paul was in the way. To make things worse, Paul had already filed with a court in New York to begin divorce proceedings. And if Paul and Leanne got divorced, well, New York law would require Leanne to come back to the state and live within 50 miles of Paul so he could see his son. But Leanne didn't want to leave Florida and Rocco, so she and Rocco hatched a plan to murder Paul. Rocco paid a guy he knew $3,000 to drive him to New York, scope out the gym with him, and serve as his getaway driver after the shooting took place. So, on the night of the murder, Rocco and this driver are sitting there and they see this huge guy walk into the parking lot, and he goes to his black Yukon, and Rocco thought this was his target, because Paul was also a big guy who happened to own the same make and model of black Yukon that his best friend Alex owned. So Rocco rushed out of the van and gunned down Alex in cold blood, not realizing he had shot the wrong person. When Leanne discovered what had happened, she came up with a way to try to fix things. She reconciled with Paul so he wouldn't divorce her and make her move back to New York. Then she convinced Paul to move to Florida because so many people in Amityville, including his friends, were treating him like a murderer. And then once they were back in Florida, Leanne just continued her affair with Rocco. And her plan was to divorce Paul after both of them had become Florida residents, because that way she would not be forced to leave the state. And all of this came to light after the guy in custody with the NYPD told police he had information about Alex's murder. It turned out the guy in custody actually happened to know the driver of the white minivan, and so this guy in custody had actually heard all the details of everything that had happened during the murder. So Detective Anderson tracked the driver down, and he discovered that the driver was struggling with a drug problem, and the driver said that's why he had accepted the $3,000 to drive Rocco to and from the gym in Amityville, and the driver quickly cut a plea deal, and he would give authorities everything they needed to bring Rocco in. But even with Rocco in custody, Leanne denied having anything to do with the murder. She said she had always loved Paul and that they had even had a second child together. Leanne also tried to act like she barely knew Rocco. But soon it became clear that the child that Leanne had recently given birth to was not her husband Paul's, it was Rocco's child. And at that point, all of Leanne's denials about her role in this murder quickly fell apart. The actual killer, Rocco Salerno, was convicted of conspiracy and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Leanne, she was convicted of conspiracy and first-degree murder as well, and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She continued to maintain her innocence and appealed her conviction, but the appeal was denied. Alex's best friend Paul might have had some demons, but he had nothing to do with his friend's murder. Paul was granted custody of his and Leanne's child, and with his child, he returned to Amityville. He ended up renaming the gym Big Al's Family Fitness in honor of his fallen friend. And Paul has said that he strives to live his life and run his business with the type of integrity and kindness that would make Alex proud. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold, there might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful, and our stuff's getting wet, and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what, we got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around, he's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints and he's yelling out for his son. He's not hearing anything. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking. And after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon, that the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. Our next story is called Into Infinity. On July 11th, 1999, 17-year-old Thomas Nazzaro was taking part in a month-long mountaineering course in Alaska. He, along with 10 other students and 3 instructors, had spent the past 26 days hiking up several peaks, and now they were taking a break at the base of this glacier. They were going to hike up the glacier, but before they did, it was customary to reward the students that had done the best job over the previous few weeks, taking on all the different mountaineering skills and survival skills, and allowing those students to hike on their own up this glacier for the last couple of days. And so the instructors hand chose a couple of students that fell into that category. Thomas was one of them, and told them after this break was over, they could head up and they would see them at the end of the trip. And so feeling very proud, Thomas and the other students who had been chosen stood up and began walking up this glacier. And after a couple of hours, they had made it about 3 miles up when they found this perfectly flat area that was perfect for camping out. And so they decided that that would be their campsite for the night. And so everybody started setting up their own tent and getting their sleeping bag laid out, and Thomas volunteered to go find some water. He had heard what sounded like a stream a little ways away from where their campsite was, and so Thomas grabbed his pot and he went around the corner out of sight. After a while, when all the other students had set up their campsites, they realized Thomas had not come back yet. And so they walked around this corner and they looked and they realized it was a dead end. About 100 feet in front of them is just a huge ice wall that goes up on all 3 sides, and there's nowhere else to go, but Thomas is not up there, and he did not come back to the campsite. And so they're thinking, that's pretty weird. I mean, is he behind some ice crevasse that we can't see? And so as they're looking from a distance, they see that his water pot is sitting at the base of this ice cliff. And so they figure, okay, he's somewhere over there, obviously. And so they start walking up towards the base of the ice cliff, still yelling his name, and he's not yelling back. And they get about 3/4 of the way to this ice wall when one of the other students yells, "Stop!" And they all stop and look down where he's looking, and they all realize what's happened to Thomas. They turn around because it's extremely dangerous where they're walking, and they run back through their camp down the trail, and they find their instructors and they tell them what they think happened to Thomas. Their instructors are horrified. They run up the trail. They make it just before the base of this ice wall to get as close as they can, knowing that it's very dangerous what they're trying to do. And they realize there's nothing they can do to help Thomas. And so before long, the police are called, and it's a full-scale rescue operation on top of this glacier. The theory of what happened to Thomas is he left his campsite with his pot of water, he went around the corner so he's out of sight, and he went to the stream, the glacier stream, and he started filling up his water, but it was taking a long time because the stream just was not very powerful. And from where he was, he would have heard the sound of rushing water coming from the ice wall because there was water pouring down the ice wall. And so he would have walked over to the base of this ice cliff and put his jug out to get water, and as soon as he was right up against it, he would have slipped down into the ice. Because at the base of this ice wall was something called a moulin, which is a hole in the glacier caused by water runoff percolating down through a crack. And over the years, they can get pretty deep. And so when the police showed up, they went over to the hole and they're yelling down to Thomas, but they're not getting a response. So one of the skinnier officers put on a dry suit and then a harness and then was lowered head first into this hole. And so the inside of a moulin, it starts wide, but then it gets smaller and tighter all the way down until it comes to a point. But sometimes that point is very far down into the ice. And so this officer was hoping that at least, even if he couldn't get to Thomas, he could at least see Thomas. but after going 100 feet down, the hole got so narrow he couldn't go any farther, and even with his light, the hole just kept going. It was like into infinity all the way down into this glacier, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so after that officer was pulled out of the hole, the police went to a fiber optic cable that had a camera at the end of it, and they began lowering that down into this hole. And so down it went, deeper and deeper. It passed the 100-foot mark and all the way down until they literally ran out of cable. And so from this camera's perspective, 250 feet down into this glacier, the hole just kept on going and going and going, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so they pulled the cable out and they realized there was nothing they could do for Thomas. Since he was below 250 feet, that means he fell at least 250 feet, and so it's unlikely he survived the fall to wherever it eventually stopped. And if he did somehow survive the fall, which is a horrifying thought in some ways, he would have been wedged somewhere deep down inside of this glacier, and the water runoff coming off of the ice wall would have eventually filled up all around him and gone over his head, and he would have drowned. And so shortly after the search was started, they called it off. There really was nothing they could do. And unfortunately, his body was never recovered.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Signal.
On the morning of August 7th, 1981, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer named Carl McCunn stood on the edge of a lake in the Alaskan wilderness and chucked a box of ammunition into the water. The splash it made was surprisingly loud in the total silence that surrounded him. Carl was on the last day of a 5-month-long solo camping trip in a very remote area of northern Alaska that was actually inside the Arctic Circle. A plane had dropped him off here in early spring, and he had set up his tent by this lake, which was surrounded on all sides by forest and huge snowy mountains. And during this 5-month trip, Carl had not seen or spoken to another person the entire time. There were no phones, no roads, no rangers, no people around for at least 100 miles. I mean, this is true isolation. Carl looked up into the sky and listened carefully for the low roar of the plane that was supposed to pick him up today. But as he listened, he couldn't hear anything. But this didn't worry Carl, because he actually had only arranged for his pickup date, not the pickup time. So it was just at some point on this day he was going to get picked up. He didn't know exactly when. And so as he anxiously waited, he just kind of puttered around his campsite and continued to pack up his things. And as Carl did this, he remembered that the type of plane that was going to be picking him up today, it was his buddy Rory's plane, it was really small. And there was a chance that he couldn't actually fit all of his belongings on the plane. And so in anticipation of this, he had identified that he didn't need all of his ammo. And so that's why he was chucking his ammo into the lake, basically in preparation for pickup. Just then, a breeze kicked up, and so Carl zipped his parka up to his chin. This was actually the so-called warm season in the Arctic Circle, but warm in the Arctic Circle meant still near freezing temperatures at night. And as much as Carl loved being out in the wilderness, doing these solo camping trips out in the middle of nowhere, he really was excited to get back to his home in Anchorage, Alaska, and see his friends and call his dad and, be in a nice warm house for once. Carl was about to chuck his 6th and final box of ammunition into the lake when he heard the loud sound of a wolf howling on the other side of the lake, and it made him stop for a second, and he decided that, maybe until the plane gets here, I'll hold on to at least one box of ammunition. So he stuck this final box into his bag, he picked it up, and then he walked along the shoreline up to where he had rigged a net to catch some fish. And when he got to the net, he saw he had caught 2 trout. And so he scooped the fish out, he went back to his campsite, he made a fire, cooked the fish, and as he sat down to eat them, he just kept looking up to the sky and listening, hoping for this plane to arrive soon. When he was done eating, Carl made a quick entry into his diary, kind of detailing the last day at camp, and then he finished packing up all his stuff, and he brought it all down to the waterline, ready to be picked up, and then he sat on his trunk, again just kind of waiting for his friend to show up. And by this time, it was about mid-afternoon, and still no sign of the plane. But nonetheless, Carl sat there kind of taking in the scene, this beautiful lake and nature. I mean, this is the last time he's going to be here, and so he's trying to appreciate it. After all, this had been a really successful photography trip. He had shot 500 rolls of film that he knew he could sell, and that would make enough money that he'd be able to do this again the following year. And so as Carl sat there taking in the scene and daydreaming about next year's trip, he noticed the sun was beginning to set. And when he noticed this was kind of like the first time that Carl actually became worried. This far north, the sun stayed out for nearly 20 hours a day in the summer. And so if the sun was setting right now, that meant it had to be near midnight. And so his friend Rory, who was supposed to pick him up today at some point today, well, now that we've hit midnight, Carl knew his friend had officially missed the date. And Carl had no way of contacting him to see what had happened or when he would be here. And so as dusk fell and still there was no sign of Rory, Carl continued to get more and more anxious. And finally, he had to reset up his tent, and he crawled inside, got in a sleeping bag, and went to sleep praying that his friend would be there the next day. The next day, Carl got up early and packed up his stuff and waited by the shoreline for his friend, but all day he waited and the plane still never came. Carl tried to convince himself that, maybe his friend got mixed up on the dates, or, maybe something came up that's delayed him a couple of days, but he'll be here. But then another day came and went, and then another, and still no plane. And it was around this time that Carl remembered something that made him feel sick to his stomach. On the night 6 months earlier, when he and Rory had discussed pickup plans, Carl remembered that night had been filled with drinking. I mean, these guys were just laughing and having a good time. And at some point, as the beers were flowing, Carl had asked Rory, "Hey, can you pick me up on August 7th at the end of my trip?" And Rory had said, "Yeah, I can probably do that." But Rory had also said that he would have to check his schedule first before he could 100% commit to this. And Carl, in his excitement about going on this trip and getting ready for it and all that, had just forgotten to follow up with Rory and make absolutely sure he could pick him up. And so now Carl was realizing that Rory wasn't delayed or mixed up about the dates. Rory wasn't coming. And Carl knew there was zero chance of another plane just happening to fly over the area and that plane picking him up. I mean, for the entire summer Carl had been out here, he had literally not seen any planes. His best hope was that his dad or maybe one of his friends would report him missing. But he knew that was unlikely, and it actually was his own doing. Carl traveled constantly and almost never told people where he was going or when he'd be back. And on one trip recently, Carl had gone out and missed his return date, and his dad had been concerned about him and so called the police. And when Carl had come back and realized what his dad did, he told his dad to never do that again. "Never contact authorities if I'm late, I'm fine." And all of this meant now Carl was going to face a brutal Alaskan winter all by himself with limited supplies and only a single box of ammunition. A few weeks later, at the end of August, Carl was still stuck out in the Alaskan wilderness. By now, Carl had fully accepted that Rory was not going to come pick him up, and Carl was doing his best not to fixate on his stupid mistake. He figured he had two choices. The first one was that he could just stay put and hope to be rescued. This was the conservative option. He knew how to get food and also firewood near his campsite, so he wouldn't starve to death and he wouldn't freeze. But this would only keep him alive. This would not actually get him rescued. The other choice was that Carl could pack up his campsite and attempt to basically hike out of here 75 miles to the nearest city, called Fort Yukon. Now, this could get him home, but with it came a much higher chance of death. If Carl did the hike, well, those 75 miles would be over extremely rough terrain with absolutely zero human-made trails. And so one little slip up and he could fall and get hurt or get lost. And also finding food was sort of a toss-up, and the weather at best would be brutal and at worst would be fatal. Plus, the entire region those 75 miles were in was absolutely teeming with wolves. Carl knew both of these choices were bad, but he was running out of time to make a decision. The brutal Arctic winter was fast approaching, and if Carl was going to attempt this horrible hike, he would really have to do it soon. And so as Carl thought about what he was going to do, he trudged his way over to one of his rabbit snares, and he was so happy to see he had caught a rabbit. And so he took the rabbit back to his camp and he cooked it over the fire, and as he's eating it, he's thinking, you know what, this isn't so bad. I caught food for now. I mean, this will keep me alive at least for a couple of days. Maybe I should just stay here. But deep down, he knew the staying put option was not a real option. I mean, even though, yes, by staying here, he could keep himself from starving, he knew how to get food and all that, well, he'd still be a sitting duck for all the predators in the area, and there were many, and remember, he only has one box of ammunition. But just then, Carl heard the most glorious sound, the distant whine of a small plane engine. At first, he thought he must be hearing things. Remember, he has not seen a plane at all since he got here. But sure enough, he looked up into the sky, and a second later, he saw a plane flying directly towards his camp, low and slow. Carl ran in his tent and grabbed the most brightly colored thing he could find, his sleeping bag, which was bright orange. He ran outside of his tent and began waving it back and forth to get the pilot's attention. Carl saw the plane belonged to the Alaska State Troopers, and so he figured his friends must have reported him missing, and now the police were out to rescue him. A moment later, the plane passed directly over Carl's camp so low to the ground that Carl could actually see the pilot looking back at him. Carl looked right at the pilot's eyes, and when Carl was nearly certain he had just made eye contact with the pilot, he threw his fist up in the air in excitement and jumped up and down. He couldn't believe it. He was saved. The pilot was going to land and take him home. With a big grin on his face, Carl watched as this plane, sure enough, made a big U-turn, and then Carl watched the plane make another pass over the camp, low and slow, which Carl figured meant, the pilot was looking for a place to land. And so as the pilot was doing that, Carl rushed to his campsite and began packing everything up, and as he did, he's kind of keeping an eye out, watching the plane, looking for it to land, but it didn't. The plane just kept on flying straight away from Carl's campsite until it disappeared over the horizon. For the rest of the day, Carl just stared off into the distance, hoping for this plane to come back, but it didn't. Lying inside his tent that night, Carl couldn't sleep. He was so shaken up by what had happened that day. He didn't understand, he saw the pilot. The pilot seemed like they were looking back at him. Why didn't they land? Why didn't they stop? Carl told himself that, maybe the terrain was too rough and there was no way for the pilot to land. That was possible. And so perhaps this pilot was flying back and getting another plane, maybe a float plane to land on the water. Carl didn't know, but he felt like that could be a possibility, and it sort of made him feel a little bit better. But he still couldn't relax enough to sleep. And so, knowing he was just going to lay there all night, he sat up, turned on his flashlight, and began looking for something to read, just to occupy his mind. Now, at this point, Carl has been out in the wilderness all alone for months and months, and he's been stranded for weeks. He has read all of his books and all of his magazines like 1,000,000 times. He's even read his diary 12 times. I mean, he's read everything. And so as he was looking around his tent, he was looking for literally anything else to read. And suddenly, he found something. His hunting license. It was like the one thing he had not closely read. Not an exciting thing to read, but new. It was just a little paper certificate with some rules and regulations and safety tips about hunting. And so Carl just began reading the front, and he read it all the way down. And then he flipped it over and he continued reading. But then he saw something that made his heart practically stop. At first he thought maybe he misunderstood. But no, he read it over and over again, and it was very clear. And so Carl looked up in shock. He suddenly understood why that pilot had left him. For weeks, Carl stayed close to his camp, just hoping and praying that somehow, some way, that plane would still come back. But it never did. And by the time Carl had actually accepted this fact that really the plane's not coming back, well, by that point, it was too late to try to hike out. So all he could do was stay put. However, the lake had frozen over, so he couldn't fish. His snares all sat empty because all the wolves and foxes got to his catches before he could. By October, Carl was getting really skinny. By November, Carl was genuinely starving. On November 26th, Thanksgiving Day, Carl laid inside of his tent and made a diary entry. There would be no Thanksgiving feast for him today. His food stores were totally gone, and the Arctic winter was getting so bad. In fact, his fingers and toes were turning black from frostbite, and he was sick all the time and constantly had chills. And as Carl wrote in his diary, he looked out the tent flap at his dying fire, knowing he had no more firewood. He knew he only had one choice left to make. He scratched a final sentence into his diary. He wrote, "They say it doesn't hurt." Then he set his diary on the floor of the tent near his rolls of film. Then he reached for his rifle and his last box of ammo. A little while later, a single shot rang out across the lake. A couple months later, in early February of 1982, Alaska State Troopers would find Carl. Carl was deceased. He had taken his own life. What Carl had only realized later was that when he made that fist pump, when he was so excited when that pilot had flown overhead and he thought he was going to get rescued, well, that fist pump had sealed his fate. Because, like it said on Carl's hunting license, a single arm raised in the air is the universally recognized body sign for all okay, do not wait. And so when that Alaska State Trooper pilot flew over Carl's camp, he did make eye contact with Carl. He saw him. But he also saw Carl raising his fist in the air and thought he was okay, and so he turned around and he left. If Carl had only read that hunting license a little bit sooner, he would have known to have raised two hands in the air as the pilot flew over for the universal sign that means, pick me up.
Around 5:15 p.m. on Sunday, May 22, 2011, 16-year-old Stephen Wiersing was riding in the passenger seat of his friend Johnny's car as they barreled through the streets of Joplin, Missouri. It was a perfect spring day. They had the windows rolled down, and their friend Dylan, who was in the back seat, was singing along to the Blink-182 song that was blasting from the radio. And as they drove, Stephen stuck his right arm out the window to feel the wind, and as he did, he admired the tattoo that ran the length of his right forearm. The tattoo spelled Stephen's last name in a style that sort of looked like graffiti. He'd gotten it 2 weeks ago, and although he loved it, his parents did not, and they were still upset that he had actually gotten it. But Stephen didn't really care. Stephen turned around and asked Dylan to pass up the bag of potato chips they'd just bought at the store. Dylan took one more handful and then thrust the bag forward, and as Stephen grabbed the bag, big raindrops began hitting the windshield. Johnny quickly rolled up the windows, and when Stephen looked outside, he noticed the sky had gone from, slightly overcast to now very dark gray. Stephen instinctively turned down the volume on the radio and then said to his friends that it looked like a serious storm was coming. Johnny nodded and said he would start driving back to his house in South Joplin where they could all wait out the storm together. But just 5 minutes later, as Johnny weaved through the back roads of the small city, the drizzling rain became a full-on downpour, and strong winds began to shake the car. Stephen leaned close to the windshield, trying to see through the heavy rain smashing into it to try to help his friend find the correct turn. But then something bounced off the window right in front of Stephen's face, startling him and causing everybody in the car to gasp. Stephen quickly realized that they were all kind of overreacting. It was just a stick that had hit the windshield, and for a second, Stephen wanted to laugh. But then all three boys heard off in the distance the ominous sound of a tornado siren, loud and clear even through the pounding rain. Growing up in a part of the country that's sometimes called Tornado Alley, Stephen and his friends had been through their fair share of tornadoes, and so they'd heard these sirens before. Normally, storms didn't really scare Stephen, but he could already tell that this tornado, was different. It had come on with almost no warning, and now more sticks and rocks were beating the sides of the car, and the gray sky had taken on a sickly orange tint. Johnny, who was white-knuckling the steering wheel at this point, turned to Stephen and Dylan and said, "Hey, we're almost at my house. I'm going to try to outrun the storm." And then Johnny hit the gas, turned right, and the rain actually suddenly stopped. For a moment, all Stephen and his friends could hear was just the urgent wail of the tornado siren. But then this overwhelmingly loud rumbling noise like a jet engine made Stephen suddenly cover his ears. And then pieces of cement and plywood began crashing into the car, this time shattering the passenger side window and filling the car with broken glass. Stephen turned to his friends, absolutely terrified, and he could see from all their looks that they were scared too. And then Stephen realized that the reason the rain had just stopped for a second is because Johnny had just unknowingly driven directly into the path of the tornado. But now there was basically nothing they could do. Johnny continued to try to drive, but the car began to shake harder and harder, and then Stephen felt the entire vehicle literally rise off the ground until none of the wheels were touching the road. Stephen and the others did their best to try to shield their bodies from all the debris flying through the broken window, but as the car began to spin faster and faster in midair, Stephen felt the wind pulling him out of the car. He screamed and his friends grabbed his legs, frantically trying to keep him inside. And then, as suddenly as the car had risen off the ground, it came smashing back down onto the street, landing on its roof and throwing the 3 teenagers out onto the street. But the tornado was not finished with them yet. Stephen's friends gripped the car to brace themselves against the strong winds, but Stephen had fallen further away from the vehicle, and he was again swept back up into the swirling vortex, this time with no car around him to protect him. Stephen watched as his friends grew smaller and smaller as Stephen was sucked farther up into the air. For just a moment, Stephen was acutely aware of the roaring wind and the debris pummeling him from all sides, and then everything went black. On the other side of town, Stephen's father, David, listened to the weather report on TV while he made sure all of his windows were shut and locked. The meteorologist said that a giant, mile-wide tornado was wreaking havoc on the southern part of Joplin, with winds blowing over 200 miles per hour. But even people who lived further north, like David, should still take cover. Just then, David's landline phone rang, and when he picked it up, he heard his ex-wife, Carissa, speaking, and she sounded very concerned. She asked David if he had heard from either of their sons. Ever since David and Carissa had gotten divorced, the couple shared custody of their kids, and both boys were staying at David's house that weekend. Carissa said she'd been trying to get in touch with the boys to warn them about the tornado, but she couldn't get in touch with them. Neither of them were answering their phones. David told Carissa that he had spoken to their younger son, Nathan, and he was safe, but he hadn't heard from Stephen all weekend, which was actually normal, because at the time, Stephen was going through a rebellious phase. Stephen and his dad had gotten into a big argument after Stephen decided to drop out of high school, and lately, Stephen would leave home for days at a time without telling anyone where he was, and he would do the exact same thing when he was staying at his mother's house. But David knew, despite all that, Stephen had a good heart, and he wouldn't just ignore his parents' phone calls when they just wanted to know that he was safe. So David told Carissa he would try to get in touch with Stephen. So David hung up and then used his cell phone to call and text Stephen. He didn't get a response, and as the rain and wind picked up outside and the tornado sirens continued to blare, David started to worry. He told himself that, Stephen was probably at one of his friends' houses, but Stephen had buddies all over the city. What if he'd been visiting someone in South Joplin, in the tornado's path? But there really wasn't anything David could do. With the storm outside, David basically just had to stay home and wait it out before he went out looking for his son. 30 minutes later, David was glued to the news, and the meteorologist finally reported that the tornado in South Joplin had passed and it was now safe for people to go outside. David still had not been able to contact Stephen, so as soon as he heard the all clear, he grabbed his keys and ran out to his car. David planned to drive to the 2 hospitals in Joplin to check if Stephen was at either one. And as he drove, David felt a bit of relief seeing that his neighborhood was still in good shape. There was debris here and there, and a few thin trees had snapped in half, but nobody's houses or cars were severely damaged. However, David's relief turned to anxiety as he drove further south, where the tornado had actually touched down, and he saw the widespread devastation. To David, it looked like a giant had stomped right on top of the town. Houses were flattened into piles of wood and brick, power lines had collapsed, battered cars and trucks were littered all over the streets, creating roadblocks that were nearly impossible to pass. David turned on the car radio to see what the local news station was saying about the storm, and a reporter came on and said the tornado had been categorized as an EF5, which is the highest on the scale. Thousands of buildings had been damaged or destroyed, hundreds of residents were injured, and dozens of people had already been found dead. David fought hard to keep his anxiety at bay, praying that Stephen had not been in this area when the tornado had come through. Finally, David reached St. John's Regional Medical Center, and he was horrified to see that the huge multi-story building had been decimated too.
An entire side of the hospital was now gone, and David could see first responders running in and out of the building, hustling survivors out. And so David just turned and began driving toward Joplin's other hospital, called Freeman Health System. As he pulled into the parking lot, David was relieved to see that Freeman was still standing. And so he parked his car in the lot and then ran inside. Entering Freeman Hospital was like walking into a nightmare. The emergency room was crowded with people who'd been injured, some quite badly. David saw one man who had a bloody, obviously broken leg, and there was a woman with shards of glass literally sticking out of her arms and chest. He could hear children crying and the muted sounds of an ambulance pulling up outside. And at least a dozen people were lined up in front of the reception desk, all new patients waiting to be checked in. David didn't want to waste valuable time waiting in that line, so he just started walking around the lobby asking random hospital employees if they'd seen a skinny 16-year-old boy with dark shaggy hair. But everyone he talked to said no. But just then, a doctor came out of the doors that led to the emergency room, and her blue scrubs were stained with blood, and she looked completely overwhelmed. But David just sprinted right up to her and asked her the same question. Hey, have you seen my son? You know, he's 16, he's got scraggly hair, he's skinny, and he also has a big tattoo on his right forearm. When the doctor heard this, in particular the right forearm tattoo comment, the doctor's expression changed, and she told David to please follow her. And she led him through the chaotic hallway and into a room where a teenage boy was lying unconscious on a bed with a breathing tube inserted directly into the front of his neck. His face was so badly injured that David didn't actually recognize him. But then the doctor walked over to the boy and gently lifted up the boy's right arm and showed David the tattoo. And when David saw it, he knew immediately he'd found his son. The doctor said a good Samaritan had brought Stephen and one of his friends to the hospital, and Stephen apparently had been riding around with two other teenage boys when their car had been sucked up into the tornado. The other two teenagers were okay, but Stephen was not. He was in terrible shape. He had a serious head injury, several cracked ribs, a punctured lung, and a deep open wound on his abdomen that left the right side of his rib cage totally exposed. But despite all his injuries, the doctor said that hospital staff had been able to stabilize him. And so right now, the doctor said he was doing basically as well as he could be, and they hoped he would just continue to improve. David was shocked and horrified and heartbroken to hear what his son had gone through, but the doctor at least sounded somewhat optimistic, which made David hopeful too. And so David thanked the doctor and then called Stephen's mother, Carissa, to tell her the bad news. 5 days later, Carissa sat beside her son's hospital bed, wishing that Stephen could talk to her. The doctors were keeping him in a medically induced coma so that his brain could heal from his traumatic head injury. But Carissa spoke to him anyway, telling him that she loved him and that he was strong. And she wanted to believe that her son could hear her because he did seem to be doing better. Some of Stephen's bruises were lightening up, and the smaller scrapes and cuts he had were starting to heal as well. But one side of his face was still covered in a thick scab, and Carissa had not yet dared to look beneath the huge white bandage that stretched from her son's belly button up to his right armpit. Carissa reached out to hold Stephen's hand, and she noticed that his fingers looked bigger than usual, like they were swollen. Carissa got up and walked to the other side of his bed, and she saw that his other hand looked swollen too. A few minutes later, when a nurse came in to check on Stephen, Carissa asked about Stephen's hands. The nurse looked closely and said the swelling in his hands might be caused by an infection inside of his body. The nurse did not seem that concerned, but she told Carissa she would ask the doctor to get Stephen started on a course of antibiotics right away, which should help his body fight off this infection. Carissa nodded and gave the nurse a weak smile like she was okay with this answer, but inside, she had no idea what kind of infection caused a person's hands to swell up so much. But the nurse did not seem like she had any time for questions. She was already rushing out of the room. Carissa knew the doctors and nurses were doing their best, but they were clearly overworked, and it worried her that they hadn't noticed these signs of Stephen's potential infection. But Carissa just felt glad that she was at least there to look after her son and make sure his medical team didn't miss anything. And so she and David agreed to coordinate their schedules so that at least one of them was always by Stephen's side. On June 1st, so 3 days after Stephen's antibiotic treatment began, Carissa and David were sitting beside each other on the small couch in Stephen's room when a doctor walked in.
He had a grave expression on his face as he told the parents that the antibiotics did not seem to be working. In fact, the swelling in Stephen's hands had only gotten worse. And now he was also running a fever, and his blood pressure kept jumping and then plummeting. The doctor said that with every passing hour, Stephen's condition was getting less and less stable. And the doctor admitted that the hospital didn't have the resources to take care of Stephen at the moment. They were struggling just to find beds for all the patients who'd been injured during the tornado. The doctor said that what Stephen really needed was a team of doctors who had the time and space to care for him properly. So they suggested having Stephen airlifted 150 miles north to Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. The doctor promised Stephen would get better, more specialized care there than he could in Joplin. For the parents, this was not even a question. Of course, they would take Stephen wherever he needed to go to get better. So just a few minutes later, Carissa watched as medical staff loaded her still unconscious son into a medical helicopter, and then David jumped in after him and gave Carissa a hesitant wave goodbye. Carissa backed away and watched as the helicopter took off and began its journey, and then Carissa headed out to the parking lot, got into her car, and began the long drive north to Kansas City. That same afternoon, at the Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, a pediatric infectious disease specialist named Dr. Mary Ann Jackson stepped into the room where her newest patient had just arrived. Dr. Jackson, who was a very energetic woman, had decades of experience treating children with unidentified infections, which made her the perfect person to take care of Stephen. She'd already been briefed on his condition, so when she went into his room, she was not surprised to see him laying there unconscious with a breathing tube down his throat. Dr. Jackson introduced herself to Stephen's father, who was in the room, and she explained that she was here to figure out what was causing his son's hands to swell up. And then Dr. Jackson walked over to Stephen and looked at his hands, which were definitely still very swollen, but she couldn't see any open wounds on his hands or wrists where an infection could develop. And so Dr. Jackson began to check out the rest of Stephen's injuries. The scabs on his face were healing well, and so too were the cuts and bruises on his arms and legs. That just left Stephen's biggest wound, the one on his abdomen, which was currently covered by a huge white bandage. Dr. Jackson carefully removed that bandage, and even though the doctors from Freeman Health System had warned her about the severity of Stephen's injury, she still was not prepared for what she saw. His entire side was exposed. The skin, fat, and muscle that would normally protect his ribcage had all been ripped away. And then Dr. Jackson noticed that sort of surrounding this horrible wound on his abdomen was this weird, shiny black material that almost looked like patent leather. Dr. Jackson recognized this as dead tissue. Whatever infection Stephen had, it was causing the skin and muscle around the wound to die and turn black. Dr. Jackson knew that this was obviously a very dangerous situation. Dead tissue can be a breeding ground for all kinds of dangerous bacteria, plus it stops wounds from healing properly. Dr. Jackson explained to Stephen's father they would need to bring his son in for surgery immediately. All of that dead black tissue around Stephen's wound would need to be surgically removed as soon as possible. David looked uneasy, but he said, okay, whatever you have to do. And then he squeezed his son's hand and told him that he was strong and he was going to be okay. And then a nurse came in and wheeled Stephen away to be prepped for surgery. That evening, in the operating room, Dr. Jackson watched as a surgeon carefully removed sections of the thick black tissue from around Stephen's chest wound. The surgeon cut away as much dead tissue as he could find, but what was left behind didn't look very healthy either. Dr. Jackson could already tell that Stephen was almost certainly going to need another operation after this one. And so after the surgeon was done and began putting a fresh bandage over Stephen's chest, Dr. Jackson took samples of the dead tissue they'd removed and sent them to the hospital lab for analysis. 2 days later, Dr. Jackson was back in the operating room, standing next to the surgeon as he held a scalpel close to Stephen's chest. They had not received the results of tissue analysis from the lab yet, but when Dr. Jackson checked in on Stephen that morning, she realized she had been right. He definitely needed more surgery. Because not only was there more dying and blackened tissue surrounding Stephen's wound, but something even more disturbing was happening. Something that Dr. Jackson had never seen in over 25 years of practicing medicine. Looking down at Stephen's exposed ribs,
Dr. Jackson and the surgeon both saw fuzzy black material growing on top of Stephen's bones and into his muscles. Dr. Jackson turned to the surgeon and said it sort of looked like mold. And so whatever infection Stephen had, it was clearly eating away at his flesh and also spreading throughout his chest cavity. And even though Stephen was on huge doses of antibiotics, this infection kept on growing at an alarming rate. Dr. Jackson watched as the surgeon carved away as much of the mold and dead tissue as he could. But still, Dr. Jackson knew this was not sustainable. With each surgery, they were chopping off more and more of Stephen's skin and muscle. And so they couldn't just keep doing that because that would eventually kill him. Plus, this infection appeared to just grow back anyway. But regardless, when the surgeon was finished and Stephen went back to the recovery room, Dr. Jackson briefed his parents about what she and the surgeon had found. She still didn't know what this infection was, but it was clearly very aggressive and was not responding to any of the medications the doctors had tried so far. Dr. Jackson swore she was going to do everything she possibly could to help their son, but she admitted it was going to take a miracle for their son to pull through this. David looked at the doctor with tears in his eyes. He said he didn't understand how this was happening. One moment, Stephen was a perfectly healthy kid. The next, he was injured in this freak tornado accident. And now his body was being ravaged by some kind of mysterious flesh-eating infection, and nobody could tell them what it was, how he got it, or how to help him. It just didn't make any sense. 10 days later, Dr. Jackson arrived for her shift at the hospital. She pulled on her white coat and walked down the hallway towards Stephen's room to check on him. But she was not feeling optimistic. Ever since Stephen's second surgery, his condition had just kept on getting worse. The tissue surrounding his wound was slowly dying, and as hard as the hospital staff had tried to keep his wounds clean, that fuzzy black mold just kept coming back. But just before she got to Stephen's room, a lab technician stopped her in the hallway and told her they'd finally gotten the results of Stephen's tissue analysis. This lab report did explain what was causing Stephen's life-threatening infection. And while Dr. Jackson was glad to finally have some answers, she knew that this diagnosis was not good news. The rare infection that was ravaging Stephen's body had less than a 20% survival rate, and the only treatment was absolutely brutal. Surgeons would need to cut every last bit of the infection out of his body. And so just a few hours later, Dr. Jackson was once again in the operating room with the same surgeon who had performed Stephen's first two surgeries. And as the surgeon sliced away mold and dead tissue, he suddenly turned to Dr. Jackson with a horrified expression on his face. Now, the mold was not just on Stephen's bones and in his muscles. Mold had also made its way into Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. In order to get this infection out of Stephen's body, the surgeon was going to have to remove parts of Stephen's vital organs. Dr. Jackson told the surgeon that they just didn't have any other choice. Stephen might die if he lost parts of these organs, but he would definitely die if the surgeon left any trace of the infection behind. So, the surgeon very carefully began to cut away moldy sections of Stephen's lungs, liver, and heart. And when the surgery was over, Stephen had lost so much bodily tissue that Dr. Jackson could literally see his internal organs through the gaps in his ribs. She could see his lungs inflate and could see what was left of his heart still beating. And so even though Dr. Jackson wanted to remain optimistic, looking down at the mangled boy, she just couldn't imagine how he was going to survive this. 8 weeks later, in August of 2011, Stephen's mom, Carissa, was curled up on the fold-out bed in Stephen's hospital room, trying her best to relax. She had stayed there almost every night that summer, but she rarely got any sleep. Even after the doctors had removed parts of Stephen's vital organs, the infection kept coming back. And so Stephen had undergone 12 more surgeries to remove mold and dead tissue from inside of his chest. And then, a few days after Stephen's most recent surgery, Dr. Jackson had roused Carissa to tell her that for the first time, the mold had not come back. They had finally cured Stephen's infection. At first, Carissa wanted to celebrate, but then reality came crashing down on her. As doctors worked hard to save Stephen's life, his body had been damaged almost beyond repair. Despite this infection being gone, he might never wake up from his coma.
And even if he did, at a minimum, he was going to need multiple reconstructive surgeries and years of physical therapy. And so that evening, thoughts about her son's uncertain future kept Carissa wide awake as usual. And so, needing a distraction, Carissa sat up, grabbed the TV remote, and flipped through the channels until she found MTV, Stephen's favorite channel. And then she sat upright on the hard fold-out bed and reached over to hold her son's hand. Out of the corner of her eye, she could have sworn she saw Stephen move. Carissa turned her head and looked at Stephen, and she saw that she was not mistaken. Stephen was blinking. His eyes were now wide open. For the first time since the tornado nearly 3 months ago, her son was awake. Stephen looked around the room, confused about where he was and what was happening, and then a moment later, he looked right at his mom. And she burst out laughing and crying at the same time, totally overcome with joy. The following morning, Dr. Jackson stood next to Stephen's hospital bed. Stephen's parents were both in the room, and they both looked happier and more energized than they had in months. Although Dr. Jackson had been treating Stephen since June, this was the first time she was really meeting him, and the shaggy-haired teenager had a lot of questions for her. He said that the last thing that he could remember was tumbling out of his friend's car and being pulled up into the tornado. He had no idea what happened after that. Dr. Jackson told him that the fact that he was alive was a miracle. She explained how terribly injured he'd been after the tornado, but that wasn't even the worst of it. After being hurt, he'd developed this infection that ate away at his skin, muscles, and organs, and very nearly killed him. This incredibly rare infection was called zygomycosis, and it was caused by a fungus that had invaded Stephen's body. The fungus blocked off his blood vessels, causing his skin and muscle tissue to die and rot. At the same time, it grew rapidly inside of his body, appearing as black mold on his ribs and in his muscles and organs. This fungus usually lives in water or underground, and it doesn't normally make people sick. However, during the devastating tornado, which killed over 150 people and injured thousands of others, this fungus had been swept up into the vortex. And after Stephen's chest was cut wide open, that fungus that was in the tornado was literally blown into his chest cavity, where it took hold and began multiplying quickly. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention determined that 12 other people who were affected by this tornado had also developed the same horrible infection as Stephen because they had open wounds and the fungus was blown inside of them. But Dr. Jackson actually told Stephen that compared to some of the other victims, he was one of the lucky ones. 5 of those 12 other people affected by this fungus had died. Stephen had to spend another 3 months in the hospital before he was healthy enough to go home. Even then, he underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries and was left with a giant scar stretching from his belly button almost to his neck. But much like the tattoo he got when he was 16, Stephen feels like his huge tornado scar is an important part of his story because it shows how far he's come. After his battle with deadly fungal infection, Stephen decided to go back to school and finish his education. And today, he's a proud father to 4 young kids, and he couldn't be happier. Although, from time to time, he still has nightmares about the tornado that changed his life. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories, we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved.
And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash-Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen.